Hello and welcome. In this video we're talking about managing user properties. So when we're in Windows 10 and we're looking at a user object, you're going to notice that we have three general tabs. We have a general tab, a members of tab, and a profiles tab. From the general tab you can do things like being able to set a change password option or never to expire password, or you can also disable an account. We have the members of, that's going to be everything that the member belongs to in other groups, and we have the profiles tab. It's important to realize that if we're wanting to disable a user, we do that from the general tab. And what's really interesting is when we're talking about a user profile, the user profile will contain information about the environment specific for that user. For example, profile settings might include the desktop arrangement of icons, program groups, screen colors, screen themes, screensavers, things like that. Anything that the user sees that's unique to them during login or during the time that that user is logged in. Each time you log into the Windows 10 computer, the system will check to see if you have a local user profile in the users folder, which is created at the boot process of Windows, or if you've created a new user and you've logged in as them. A folder which matches the user logon name will then be created, and you'll use that folder. The user profile folder will also create a file called ntuser.dat, as well as subfolders that basically lay out the structure of that user profile. A drawback of using a local user is that files that are used by the local user are on that computer and that computer alone. So let's actually look to see where we can see that ntuser.dat, because that's an important file. So I'm logged into my Windows 10 machine, and I'm going to browse to my user profile. I'm logged in as student, and you're going to see this nt.dat. If you don't see it, if you go up to view, you can hide or unhide files. ntuser.dat is hidden by default. And if you want to open it, like let's say a notepad, you can't. Every time you make modification, we can actually copy it to the desktop. And you can't even do that because it's open. As long as you're logged in as this user, this file is constantly in use. Every time you modify the desktop or modify anything specific to the user graphically, it's being stored in that ntuser.dat file. So since we said we have profiles and we look for a local user first, we have to look at what a roaming profile or other profile types might be. A traditional profile is a local profile on one machine. A roaming profile is basically where you can take the system drive, users, and user folder, and you can store that somewhere else, like on a centralized server. That way, as the user logs in, you can actually load their profile from a remote server. That way, their data may go with them. So if we're looking at our Windows 10 machine, and we go to computer management and we're exploring a user, here the profile tab is going to be where their profile is. You can give a profile path. If you don't do it, then it's going to use the local path, which is C user. And you can also use variable names like username. That path right there essentially will translate to whatever my username is. My username, my current logged in user, is called student. So, and you'll notice it refreshed up there. So you can use variable names. So this is the default profile path. If you set a server share up, you could list it as a share. You also have the ability to do logon scripts. If you want to enforce a mandatory profile, a mandatory profile basically is the user cannot change the way certain things are. When they log off and log back on, the ntuser.dat file doesn't get modified or doesn't get changed. And if the user logs in as a mandatory profile and that profile is not accessible, it will create a temporary profile. If you want to have a mandatory profile, you change ntuser.dat to ntuser.man. Man, M-A-N, for mandatory. What's interesting here is this enforces a very specific type of profile. I've used these profiles in classrooms, for example, where I want a specific layout that is always saved. Anytime someone logs into the computer, it restores the layout to the way I want it. We also have a few other types of profiles. But before we talk about the other types of profiles, we need to talk about the way profiles are named. If we're talking Vista or 7 or earlier versions of 2008, normally these will be saved as the username.v2. If you're dealing with XP or newer, XP or older, it's going to be just a .v1. If we're dealing with version 8 in Windows or Server 2012, it's either going to be v2 before certain updates or v3. Traditionally, v3 is probably going to be where most of them are. If we have Windows 8.1 or the newer version of 2012 R2 server, they're going to be known as .v4 version profiles. In Windows 10, earlier versions of Windows 10, that's going to be between versions 1507 and 1511, they will be known as version 5 profiles. If we're dealing with Server 2016 or Windows versions 1607 through 1809, that's going to be version 6. Newer versions of Windows 10 profiles and Server 2019 profiles are also known as version 7. So what happens if we have a mandatory profile and we don't want a temporary profile set up? Those are called super mandatory profiles, and essentially we tell it so that the mandatory profile, if not able to load, do not create a temporary profile, just do not load at all. Normally, I'm going to be doing this for like a kiosk machine or like a login machine at a front office. We don't want temporary profiles loaded. We only want the default manual mandatory profile loaded. And with that, if it can't load, just don't load anything. We already talked a little bit about logon scripts. So when we're looking at our user profile settings, we have the ability to do scripts, and we basically will list the script in that location. So if we list the script here, and we have to give the absolute path, it will run that script on login. The script could be mapping a printer, could be mapping a map drive, it could be doing a lot of things. We also have a home drive. We have a local path or a server path. So a home folder is typically where a user will store their personal files that only they need access to. It will act like a private folder. So users will store their personal files, and they're the only ones that have access to that folder. The main reason you give a user home folder on the server is because the server is the one that's backed up. So if we are mapping a local folder, we may not back up those local folders. That is why you typically want to provide a server home file. That way, we can ensure to back those files up. And normally for the share, we'd give a UNC or Universal Naming Convention path. That way, it is a direct path to that save location or that folder location. So those are basic properties of a user in a nutshell. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out.